This video is designed to help you have the best experience skiing or snowboarding at Breckenridge Ski Resort. It's one of Colorado's biggest ski resorts, so it can be intimidating to even know where to start. There's plenty of easier terrain that caters to beginners and intermediates. But I think what truly makes Breck special is the huge variety of high alpine terrain that is practically unmatched anywhere else in the US. Hi, we're Jake and Emily, the two roaming souls. We're experienced travelers who make helpful guides about the world's best destinations. We've been living in Colorado ski towns off and on for the last 10 years, and we've been lucky enough to call Breckenridge home for the last 2 winters. And with myself, an expert skier, and Emily, more of an intermediate skier and snowboarder, we can provide several perspectives on getting the most out of your time here. We will help you navigate this massive resort and decide where to ski based on your ability and goals so that you get the most out of your experience. We'll share some of our frustrations about Breck, as well as things that make it truly special. This video mostly focuses on the ski resort itself, like parking, transportation, lifts, terrain, etc. But before we begin, Breckenridge is on the Epic Pass. So to ski or ride here, you will need to have an Epic Pass or purchase day lift tickets. And purchasing in advance is the best way to save money on your pass. If you need to rent gear, we recommend Ski Butlers. Use our link in the top right or in the description to get 10% off their extremely convenient rental delivery service. Alright, now on to the fun part, the skiing and snowboarding. So, how do you even begin to approach this huge ski resort? To orient yourself, it's best to recognize that Breckenridge is a rather linear resort that runs north to south across 5 different peaks of the 10-mile range. Starting at the north end with Peak 6 and going south across Peak 7, Peak 8, Peak 9, and Peak 10. This is the best way to understand roughly where you are on the resort. But a slightly confusing thing is that when people refer to a peak number, they're usually in fact talking about the base area of that peak, rather than the summit. So like if someone says, meet me at Peak 7, they mean meet them at the base of Peak 7, not literally the summit of Peak 7. And I want to mention that only Peaks 6, 7, and 8 are accessible via inbounds terrain. Okay, so knowing the span of Breck's numbered peaks is a great way to understand roughly where you are or want to go. How to begin your day at Breckenridge Ski Resort. Breck has 3 main base areas, Peak 7, Peak 8, and Peak 9. Where you start your day on the resort depends on several factors, like what type of terrain you like to ski, where you're staying, or if you're just driving into town for the day. If you're driving to the resort, Breck offers 2 free parking rides at either end of town. The airport lot at the north end of town and the ice rink lot at the south end of town. Both have free buses that run every 20 minutes to take you to the mountain. Or if you want to pay for more convenient parking, there are several other lots and parking garages closer to the mountain. The 2 major value parking lots are the North Gondola lot and South Gondola parking garage. 2 premium slopeside lots are Beaver Run and the Stables lot. And something worth noting is that all paid parking lots provide huge discounts for carpooling with 4 or more people. If you booked accommodation somewhere in Breckenridge, you can likely either walk to the nearest lift or find a free bus route that will take you to the mountain. The free ride is the town-sponsored bus network that services the core areas of Breckenridge. And Summit Stage is the free county bus network that services the more outlying areas like Boreas Pass, Blue River, and the whole of Summit County, like Frisco, Silverthorne, Dillon, Keystone, Copper, etc. To use the bus, you can research routes on their website or use the transit app for real-time info and guidance on finding the nearest bus. If you're starting from near Main Street, the 2 most popular ways to start your day are the Breck Connect Gondola and Quicksilver Superchair. The Breck Connect Gondola begins towards the north end of Main Street and Quicksilver near the south end. The Breck Connect Gondola is the most central access point for the resort. It's adjacent to the largest parking lots and also Breck Station, the center hub where all the bus routes in Breck converge. The gondola has 3 stops. The first stop is Shock Hill, which is just a neighborhood of really nice houses with no direct skiing access. So you won't ever load or unload here unless you're staying in this neighborhood. The second stop is at the base of Peak 7, and the last stop is at the base of Peak 8. These are 2 of the primary base areas of Breck, which are both a great place to start your ski day. But if you're worried about lift lines, I would get off at Peak 8 because there's 4 different chairlifts to spread out the crowds, whereas Peak 7 only has a single lift at the base area. At the base area of Peak 9, you have the Quicksilver Superchair and Beaver Run Superchair a little up the hill. Quicksilver Superchair begins within walking distance of the south end of Main Street, and it's best if you plan to ski Peak 9 or Peak 10. But calling it the Quicksilver Superchair is kind of misleading. While technically a high-speed 6-seater, it stops painfully often for beginners, and it only services green circle runs that are so flat you might think you're cross-country skiing. So anyone besides true beginners pretty much only uses Quicksilver begrudgingly as a way to connect to other chairs that service more exciting terrain. Personally, my favorite chair to start skiing from is Beaver Run. It has the highest vertical rise of any chair at Breck, and as long as you're not a complete beginner, it gets you going onto the fun terrain the quickest. And even if I'm starting from elsewhere in Breck, sometimes I think it's worth it to get a bus to Beaver Run. Or I know people who are even willing to walk the extra quarter mile in ski boots from the base of Quicksilver just to get up to Beaver Run. That's probably more of a commentary on Quicksilver than Beaver Run, but you get the idea. And then there's also the Snowflake Lift, which can be a convenient starting point if you're staying in this area, but otherwise you'll probably never ride it. A very helpful resource for getting around Breckenridge is the My Epic app. It provides real-time data about lift status, lift lines, grooming, and more. You can see what lifts are open or make decisions about where to ski based on lift lines or grooming, so it's a helpful tool to know about. There are trail maps at the top and bottom of pretty much every lift, and on some chairlifts, but those don't have the same kind of live updates that the app can provide. Where should you ski at Breckenridge? So now that you know how to access the resort, where should you ski or snowboard? Despite being one large interconnected ski resort, Breck's terrain definitely lends itself to some natural clustering, like Peak 9 and 10, Peak 7 and 8, and finally Peak 6 kind of feels like its own separate area. Traversing from Peak 6 all the way to Peak 10 can take over an hour, depending on the route taken, your ability, and if you encounter any lift lines. So my point is, I would consider choosing a specific area or two to explore, rather than trying to cover the entire resort in a day. Peak 8 and Peak 7 are right next to each other and definitely feel like the epicenter of the ski resort. With a decent amount of overlapping terrain, it's easy to travel across both with just a single lift ride or sometimes even just a single run down the mountain. Peak 9 and Peak 10 similarly feel like their own distinct cluster, especially since traveling between Peak 9 and Peak 8 isn't as easy as it would seem, especially for beginners and intermediates. Going from 9 to 8 is a little faster and easier because of the Peak 8 Super Connect chair, but going from 8 back to 9 is a pretty long and slow traverse if you have to take the blues or greens. And Peak 6 really just feels like its own distinct area unto itself, just barely overlapping with some of the terrain served by Peak 7's chairs. All ski resorts use a trail rating system for explaining the relative difficulty of the terrain. They are green circles, blue squares, black diamonds, double black diamonds, etc. These color-coded shapes are an easy way to choose terrain that suits your ability level. Let's start with the beginner terrain and work our way up to expert. For true beginners, the two ski school locations and designated learning areas are located at the base of Peak 8 and Peak 9. The Quicksilver learning area at Peak 9 and Rip's Ride learning area at Peak 8. They both have several magic carpets, pommel lifts, and very short mellow slopes for when you're just learning how to keep your balance on skis or a snowboard. If you book a lesson, you will be starting at one of these two areas. And the adjacent Quicksilver Super Chair and A Chair on Peak 9 and Rip's Ride and 5 Super Chair on Peak 8 service some groomed green circles when you feel like you're ready to graduate from the magic carpets and pommel lifts. Now let's move on to intermediate terrain, or blue squares. This is the best terrain for people who are confidently linking turns together and want something a little steeper than the greens. I would say that the majority of these runs are groomed on a daily basis. They're great if you want to work on carving technique and not worry too much about variable conditions. When it comes to steeper, groomed blue runs, personally, I think this type of terrain is what is lacking most at Breckenridge, at least for a resort of its size. I find most of the terrain below tree line to be rather flat, or at least not consistently steep. Like there are some steep pitches, but interspersed with many less steep sections that most people would just classify as a green circle. But Breck's website even says that trail ratings are relative to the terrain within each resort. So a blue square at Breckenridge is not necessarily comparable to a blue square at, say, Vail or Arapahoe Basin. And having explored lots of ski resorts, I definitely agree that the blue squares at Breck just don't feel as consistently steep as other mountains. But nevertheless, the best place to ski groomed blue squares are Peak 7, Peak 9, and to a lesser extent Peak 6. Just a quick look at the trail map and you can see that these areas are made up of a majority of blue squares. To me, Mercury Super Chair on Peak 9 stands out as the absolute best chair at Breck for lapping blue groomers. It's got the third highest vertical rise of any chair at Breck and isn't located at a base area, so the lines tend to stay reasonable. Columbia is probably my favorite run, but mostly because half the groomers on this lift are designated slow zones. And Breck does this annoying thing where entire blue runs are designated as slow zones top to bottom, which I'm all for safety, but making entire blue runs slow zones is just ridiculous. But anyway, let's pop over to Peak 6, which also has a good variety of intermediate terrain. And as I mentioned, kind of feels like its own distinct area of the resort. You can get to Peak 6 by taking the Zendo chair, which basically only exists to transport people to Peak 6. Like, it's really slow and only serves one run besides the lift line itself. So you probably won't ride Zendo chair for any other reason than just getting to Peak 6. The only other way to get to Peak 6 is traversing through the Wanderlust trees from the top of 7, which is a black diamond that requires a little bit of tree skiing, followed by a rather boring cat track connector as well. Peak 6's main chair, Kensho Super Chair, services the only intermediate terrain at Breck that is above treeline. So if you want that high alpine experience but aren't quite ready for the black diamonds or extreme terrain, Peak 6 is the place. The views of the mountain peaks as you ride up the lift are just incredible. Reverie and Bliss provide 2 groomed runs above treeline that are great. Bliss is like wide open bowl skiing, and Reverie follows the ridge down into an awesome groomer with just a few lonely trees. Kensho has the second highest vertical rise of any chair at Breck, but the runs don't quite have that long top to bottom feeling because everything pretty much funnels out onto Barton Breezeway, which basically feels like a cat track just taking you back to the bottom. If you want to lap groomers on Peak 7, I like Angel's Rest and Monte Cristo, and just use Freedom Super Chair to avoid the base area. And lastly, if you want a good groomer on Peak 8, North Star is my favorite because of its sustained steeper pitch. But otherwise, Peak 8 is not really ideal for blue groomers. Alright, let's talk about lodges and on-mountain dining. And since I'm a local, I don't know anything about any of these. But they're here, and if getting 3 chicken tenders for $20 is up your alley, pop on in. Breck has 3 terrain parks, small, medium, and large. And those sizes refer not only to the size of the park, but also the size of the features. Freeway Terrain Park is the large park located on Peak 8, and 5 Super Chair is perfectly situated to lap the park over and over quickly. There was a time when Breck was known for its terrain park, but you can tell they don't put as much emphasis on it anymore. It's got some good jumps and rails, but overall feels pretty generic, especially compared to like Copper or Keystone. Terrain parks with medium and small features are found on Peak 9. These are great if you want to progress your park skills, but aren't ready for the large features yet. However, with both being served by longer lifts, they aren't exactly as easy to lap. Alright, now let's move on to the advanced and expert terrain, which is an area that Breckenridge Ski Resort really excels. And as an expert skier, the part that I really appreciate the most. Breck has tons of black and double black diamonds, like tree skiing, bowls, cliffs, chutes, and hike-to terrain. And one of Breck's claims to fame is that the Imperial Super Chair is the highest chairlift in North America, topping out at 12,840 feet. And another crazy fact is that 40% of all the skiable terrain at Breck is above treeline. That's pretty nuts. But all that high alpine terrain doesn't come without its drawbacks. With so much terrain prone to avalanches, Breck Ski Patrol really has their work cut out for them. The sounds of bombs going off for avalanche mitigation is kind of just part of the soundtrack of Breckenridge. You can hear them going off from anywhere in the valley. And it often takes hours or even days to open up the high alpine terrain after big snowstorms. And add that to the fact that Breck is notoriously windy and cold, so the high alpine terrain can be quite temperamental. Between avalanche mitigation, wind closures, and variable snow conditions, it can be very hit or miss in the high alpine. But when you hit it on the right day, you'll be stoked. But before I talk about the high alpine terrain, let's stay below treeline and hop over to Peak 10 and Falcon Super Chair. This is probably my most skied chair at Breckenridge. Not necessarily because it's my absolute favorite, but just because it opens more reliably than the other advanced terrain. Below treeline and with limited avalanche danger, it just doesn't suffer from the same issues that keep other advanced chairs closed or on hold. If you're looking for the steepest groomers at Breck, check out the runs under Falcon Super Chair, like Crystal, Double Jack, Centennial, and Cimarron. If you're like me and feel that the groomed blues at Breck are a little flat, come check out these groomers. In exploring off the sides of Peak 10, you can find some awesome tree skiing, mogul runs, and powder stashes. Runs like Black Hawk and Dark Rider are some of my favorite runs on a powder day. But the only negative is that they all funnel down to a cat track flapjack, which is a great name for it because it's basically flat as a pancake for nearly a half mile. You've been warned. On the other side of Peak 10, the Burn is another personal favorite area to ski. Emily is always a little too intimidated by tight trees, so I'm always searching for some sparse trees where she can get more comfortable skiing in the trees without that claustrophobic feeling. While you can pop into the trees almost anywhere on the lower sections of Peak 7, 8, and 9, they tend to be made up of these really tight lodgepole pines, which doesn't make for great tree skiing, in my opinion. For more advanced terrain that's below treeline, let's pop over to E-Chair and 6-Chair. E-Chair is like the quintessential skier's chair, a fixed grip double that services some really steep, narrow runs that love to form moguls as tall as you are. Alright, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but yeah, it gets skied out pretty quick. But if you're the first one through here on a powder day, it can be really sweet. And this terrain is also all accessible from the top of Mercury Superchair as well. Across from E-Chair is 6-Chair, in a region that Breck calls their back bowls, which both names are very confusing to me. Since peak numbers are so integral to the Breck layout, having a 6-chair that's not on peak 6 is very confusing. And these alleged back bowls are basically on the same front side as everything else. But I digress. 6-chair is another fixed grip double, but its terrain is a bit more open and less steep than E-chair's terrain. And you can traverse pretty far to skier's right and just keep finding new lines to explore. It's another area with sparse trees that Emily likes to ski without feeling like the trees are too tight. Next, there's Horseshoe Bowl T-Bar. I think it's great that a mega resort like Breck still offers something with the old school vibes like a T-bar. But make no mistake, this T-bar is no dopey little lift. It climbs the rim of Horseshoe Bowl, which has some awesome advanced terrain, and nearly hundreds of lines to choose. There's plenty of little diving board type cliffs to launch, but also plenty of open space to avoid them if that's not your thing. From the top of T-bar, you can also turn right and traverse into the lower half of Peak 7 Bowl. I want to mention that T-bar can be a little challenging for snowboarders to use. It basically forces you to choose an edge and can fatigue your leg muscles just getting up the lift. T-bar and 6-chair are the only two ways to reach the Imperial Superchair, Breck's crown jewel and the highest lift in North America. Imperial takes you nearly to the top of Peak 8, and this is where you're really getting into Breck's famous high-alpine terrain, where the trees disappear and the trail names are really just suggestions. From the top of the chair, you can ski Imperial Bowl or cross over the other side and traverse into Whale's Tail and Peak 7 Bowl. And if you're really up for the challenge, you can hike the last 165 feet to the true summit of Peak 8 at just over 13,000 feet. But hiking this high is difficult for most people in ideal summer conditions. Now consider doing it with ski boots on, skis over your shoulder, and wind and snow whipping across your face. But for those who endure the challenge, the rewards are incredible. From there, you can drop into lake chutes, some of the best extreme terrain anywhere in Colorado, with giant cliffs, cornices, and chutes that will make even the most advanced skiers and riders think carefully about the line they take. And if that terrain wasn't enough, let's pop back over to Peak 6 for even more high alpine hike-to terrain. From the top of Kensho's Superchair, you can hike up another 271 feet in elevation to the summit of Peak 6. From here, there's more extreme terrain that's every bit as gnarly and impressive as Peak 8. From the Six Senses to Serenity Bowl and Beyond Bowl, with again, perhaps a lifetime of possible lines to ski or ride up here. There is one last hike-to area on Breck that I skipped over, and that's on Peak 9. From the top of Mercury and E-Chair, you can get into the back 9 and twin chutes. This is a great mix of snowfields, tree runs, and chutes to explore if you have the time, or if there's low visibility and you want to stay out of the high alpine. So I know I've covered a lot, but here's a quick summary. Beginners should stick to these areas on Peak 8 and Peak 9. Intermediates will probably enjoy groomers off of Mercury Chair on Peak 9 and Freedom Chair on Peak 7. And definitely try to get up to Peak 6 for some intermediate terrain with the best views. And as an expert skier, Peak 10 and 6-chair are my favorite for powder day tree skiing. And for the high alpine stuff, there's nothing like getting up on the top of Peak 6 or Peak 8 for some really cool terrain. Clearly, there's so much to talk about in regards to Breck's collection of expert terrain. Like I said, the high alpine alone makes up 40% of the entire resort. So this is kind of an abbreviated version. I plan to make another video entirely dedicated to skiing Breck's most extreme terrain, where I can get deeper into showing all there is to explore, how I ski on a powder day, my favorite lines, picking terrain based on conditions, and more. So with that, be sure to like and subscribe so you catch our future videos. And if you're looking for other fun things to do in Breckenridge besides skiing, like our favorite après spots, unique attractions, and more, check out our Breckenridge Top 10 video, or head over to our website, tworoamingsouls.com. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.